Opening the door for queenside development, this knight hops out, aiming to control central squares and prepare for castling. Asserting central presence immediately, this pawn stake sets the stage for an active, robust game, daring white to challenge its dominion. Establishing a commanding central pawn presence, white claims more territory and opens avenues for pieces. Developing a knight so early prepares for rapid centralization and potential pawn breaks. Asserting central space, c4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens diagonals for white's pieces. Solidifying the center, black opts for a robust pawn chain, preparing to support its central presence. Opening the center immediately, this pawn grab aims for greater piece activity and early central influence. Opening that central c-file offers immediate dynamic counterplay for black's pieces. Developing this knight immediately reinforces control of the center squares and prepares for further pawn advances, creating a dynamic pawn structure. Fortifying the center and preparing for pawn advances, this knight establishes a harmonious defensive structure. Developing the bishop to this active square puts pressure on black's central pawns and prepares for kingside castling. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, black prepares for bishop development, aiming to contest central influence with a sound, if somewhat passive, setup. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing for bishop development sets a calm yet purposeful tone. Developing the bishop here prepares to challenge white's central control and potentially launch a queenside initiative. Developing the bishop to this square strengthens the kingside and prepares castling, while also eyeing black's central pawn structure. Securing the king within its fortress allows black to focus on developing pieces and contesting central control. Securing the monarch under castle walls is a prudent step, preparing for central action. Developing the queenside pawn unlocks queenside potential and supports the c5 square. Initiating pressure along the open c-file solidifies white's queenside ambitions, aiming to exploit the vulnerable dark squares. Developing the bishop to bb7 supports the queenside pawn structure and prepares to contest the long diagonal, potentially eyeing white's kingside. Bolstering queenside presence by preventing a timely b5 counterstrike. Establishing a potent presence on the open c-file, preparing for potential exchanges and pressure. Securing the queen's influence, this maneuver aims to connect the rooks and prepare for potential central advances. Trading the bishop frees up black's queenside pawns and opens a diagonal, potentially activating the remaining pieces. Opens the e-file for immediate pressure, forcing black to consider pawn structure weaknesses. A bold knight excursion, aiming to disrupt white's queenside harmony and potentially seize the c4 square. Fortifying the rook's presence on the c-file now shores up the pawn structure and prepares potential pressure. Targeting the c4 square with the knight creates an imbalance, potentially forcing white into awkward defensive postures or a concession of the center. Securing the crucial open c-file with this rook now pressures black's queenside pawn structure and prepares for potential advances down the center. Consolidating influence on the queenside with a pawn step often signals a desire to restrict enemy knight incursions. Retreating the knight to b1 abandons the queenside and forfeits key central squares, signaling a passive stance. Launching a queenside pawn storm, black aims to disrupt white's cramped position and open lines for activity. Liberating the queenside pawn allows better development for white's pieces. Shifting the knight to d6 opens a path for the c8 rook and seeks to exploit the open files. Clearing the central file now frees up white's rook for action, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Clearing the c-file now opens lines for both sides, a crucial pivot towards potential piece exchanges. Initiating a bold knight sortie, white aims to exploit the now open e5 square for tactical threats. The bishop retreats, preserving its mobility and eyeing potential central breaks. Launching a kingside assault, white aims to destabilize black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Strengthening the kingside pawn structure, but potentially weakening the dark squares around the king. Securing the king on the g2 square prepares for potential pawn storms and anchors the monarch against any central disruptions. A strategic repositioning, aiming to shift the knight from its potentially vulnerable outpost to a more fluid central role. The queen's relocation to e3 aims to bolster the kingside while eyeing potential pawn breaks, subtly preparing for a later central or queenside engagement. Challenging the central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's control and potentially open lines for piece activity. Shifting the knight to the queenside opens up possibilities for central pawn advances, aiming to break down black's solid structure. Knight reroutes to a more active square, eyeing kingside expansion and potential pressure on the center. Solidifying king's safety before launching any pawn storm. Seeking active piece play, this queen ventures forward, eyeing the queenside and potentially opening new lines for attack. Seizing the open file aims to pressure black's queenside weaknesses. Hoping to reroute the knight toward the kingside, a bold but risky repositioning of forces. Reorganizing the rook offers flexibility, preparing for a potential pawn push on the queenside or reinforcing the center. Doubling rooks on the semi-open c-file solidifies control and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Exchanging the rooks opens the path for white's knight to become a far more active piece on the queenside. Black recaptures the rook, solidifying control of the now open c-file and preventing white's knight from finding further outpost opportunities. Initiating a kingside pawn storm now leverages the slightly exposed enemy monarch, aiming to crack open attacking lines. Asserting central presence now, black aims to solidify the queenside before the inevitable king hunt. Sacrificing the pawn opens lines and aims to disrupt black's defensive setup. Challenging white's control of the kingside, black seeks counterplay with this knight's dynamic repositioning. Boldly claiming the center, this knight seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for an attack. Reclaiming a central knight after a pawn sacrifice, preparing to contest the king's file. Refocusing the queen to the center can pressure black's isolated pawns and prepare for a central advance. The knight's retreat aims to reinforce the d6 square and prepare for future pawn pushes or piece exchanges. Shifting the queen seeks to avoid the knight's outposts and prepare a pawn storm on the kingside. Swapping queens here significantly simplifies the position, accelerating the transition into a more open endgame battle. Simplifying to an endgame after the exchange, white prepares to activate the bishop pair. Nurturing the knight's new central role, preparing for potential pawn breaks or maneuvers. Reclaiming the central square allows the knight to redeploy and pressure black's pawn structure. Exchanging this knight severs a key defensive link, potentially opening a path for white's king to become exposed. Opens the f-file for a potential rook invasion and exposes black's king slightly. Reclaiming central space and preparing to challenge the white king is the immediate goal. Unlocking king activity signals an immediate endgame transition, aiming to exploit central space. The knight's journey to c7 aims to find more active squares and challenge white's pawn structure, potentially preparing for future advances. Centering the king revitalizes its dormant potential, preparing for a more active role in the dawning endgame. Shifting the king is key now, preparing to support the pawn chain and become more active in the center. Opening the knight's path to c3 might offer counterplay if black's kingside presence falters. Shifting the king to the center aims to activate it for the ensuing endgame, avoiding passive squares. Shifting the knight to the kingside aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potentially threaten the black king. Opening a queenside avenue with this pawn thrust aims to exploit white's potentially vulnerable king. Knight's repositioning aims to contest the d-file and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. Asserting control over the d4 square, this knight aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open new attacking avenues. Securing the queenside pawn chain to prevent black's infiltration. Opening the queenside pawn structure creates counterplay and simplifies into a potentially favorable pawn race. Expanding the pawn chain on the queenside offers a structural advantage. Asserting the knight's presence on the queenside pawn chain is a tactical necessity for immediate counterplay. This king repositioning aims to redeploy forces centrally, hinting at a future queenside expansion. Reactivating the knight offers counterplay against white's pawn structure. Securing the king's diagonal advance is paramount for future pawn pushes. The knight hops to d8, seeking a safer outpost away from the knight outposts and preparing to redeploy. Pushing the h-pawn aims to gain space and potentially activate the kingside pawns further. Pondering a reorientation, the knight seeks a more active outpost, perhaps on e5, to pressure white's weakened queenside. Deploying the knight to this outpost secures the kingside and prepares a central pawn push. Resurrecting the bishop towards the queenside offers new attacking avenues on that flank. Relocating the king to the center initiates the endgame's king activity, aiming to leverage its newfound mobility. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal to support the pawn advance. Reactivating the bishop and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The knight's repositioning to h6 aims to reroute itself to a more active square, potentially the f5 outpost, while also defending against pawn advances. Breaching the pawn chain's integrity now opens critical lines for your rook. Pivoting the knight to f5 opens up critical diagonals and prepares for a potential attack on white's centralized king. Opening lines can destabilize the king's sanctuary. Black must remain vigilant. Opening the h-file grants decisive attacking chances for white's king. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking influence in the center of this endgame dance. The monarch seeks a safer haven amidst the simplified, yet still potentially sharp position. Consolidating the bishop aims to improve its defensive posture. Repositioning the bishop aims to reroute it to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting the knight's advance. Probing the kingside now, aiming to exploit that backward pawn if black isn't careful. The king ventures out, seeking active participation, but exposes itself to potential enemy advances. Navigating the knight to a more active square, ready to challenge black's defensive setup. Shifting the bishop to the edge offers a passive defense and relinquishes control of key diagonals. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to control crucial squares and disrupt black's pawn structure. The king becomes a primary target on the open diagonals, necessitating careful defensive positioning. Activating the bishop here prepares to contest the kingside pawn advances, a crucial area for controlling space. Reactivating the bishop to square d7 prepares to join the fight on the kingside or potentially create counterplay. Swinging the knight to this outpost on c5 immediately pressures black's weakly defended pawn chain. Shifting the king towards the queenside appears to be a defensive maneuver, potentially seeking shelter or preparing to support pawn advances there. Solidifying the king's central presence initiates a methodical approach to consolidating the advantage. Shifting the bishop to the queenside aims to free up space and potentially support a future pawn advance, or at least reposition for better defensive coverage. Activating the bishop to the queenside adds pressure, seeking pawn breakthroughs to open lines for the king. The black king abandons its central haven, heading towards a potentially exposed wing as pawns remain locked on the kingside. Centralizing the king offers a more robust defensive structure and better piece coordination for the upcoming endgame battle.